Hello tributes and welcome to part 2 of the 190th Hunger Games. Now, before we start, I would like to thank Andrew McLean who made a lot of the art featured in this video, and I would also like to thank Christian Blanco who made Tales of the Hunger Games, as well as Laura McCouch who made Pen and Reborn. And that's all I gotta say before beginning this video. So yeah, let's get into part 2 of the 190th Hunger Games. Previously on the 190th Hunger Games, the Quell twist was announced to be that in order to prove that even the disabled fought with the districts during the rebellions, the tributes would be reaped from a bowl of tributes that were missing one of the 5 senses. In District 12, the grandchildren of deceased victor Mercy Horowitz fought for the tribute spots in District 12. Both of the tributes reaped this year would be Mercy's blind grandchildren Mercy Elizabeth Horowitz and Hopper Horowitz. In District 10, twin siblings fought with others in order to gain a tribute spot. The tributes ended up being the twin siblings, 17-year-old Tia and Tio Alvarez. Tia being blind and Tio being unable to feel pain. In District 8, the 2 tributes that were reaped were a pair of best friends from the district, Andrew Tollett and Yara Hakim. Andrew being deaf and Yara being mute. This pair was the perfect match for communication. The tributes from the career districts, along with District 8, made an amazing first impression on the Capitolites. The deaf and mute tributes did especially well with the deaf and mute children of the capital and other districts. Meanwhile, the blind tributes did especially well with other blind people. During training, Tia, Tio, Mercy Elizabeth, and Hopper ended up forming an alliance with Treasure from 1, Colin from 1, Eliana from 2, Trevor from 2, River from 4, Liana from 7, and Everett from 7. Meanwhile, Yara and Andrew formed an alliance with Megan from 3, Lewis from 6, Mazalia from 9, and Maze from 9. After the interviews, the tributes returned to their rooms. Yara, Andrew, Tia, Tio, Mercy Elizabeth, and Hopper all ended up being out on their balconies when something truly horrific occurred. Down on the District 4 balcony, Atrophilia and River broke out into another intense argument. This time, though, Atrophilia threw a few punches at River. Eventually, the pair's fight ramped up and Atrophilia ended up pushing River off of the balcony, causing him to die when he hit the ground. Treasure had also been out on her balcony when the fight was happening, and she saw River fall past her balcony. She had gotten off of the couch and ran to the edge of her balcony just in time to see River hit the ground. Just then, peacekeepers came out onto the District 4 balcony and shot Atrophilia to death. All the tributes that weren't deaf that were on their balconies could hear the shots and were immediately terrified. This fear was even more evident with Treasure, Yara, and Mercy Elizabeth, although Yara was still able to sign to Andrew what had happened on the District 4 balcony, which also immediately brought fear into Andrew's eyes. The next day, the tributes were taken into the hovercrafts. Half of the tributes ended up being put in one hovercraft, and the other half in the other. Yara, Andrew, Tia, Tio, Mercy Elizabeth, and Hopper all ended up being in the same hovercraft, along with Liana, Everett, Mazalia, and Maze. The careers all glared at each other in the hovercraft. Mercy Elizabeth glared at Andrew mostly. Meanwhile, Yara and Andrew held each other tightly, scaring Mazalia and Maze a little. The group also used sign language to communicate how threatened they felt of each member of the Career Alliance. They all seemed to unanimously agree that Everett, Mercy Elizabeth, and Hopper seemed to be the most threatening, seeing as they were all related to past victors. They also seemed to agree that Tio was also a big threat, considering he couldn't feel pain. The only thing they couldn't seem to agree on was which career they thought was the least threatening. When the tributes got to the arena, they were escorted to their launch rooms. In Yara's launch room, she paced back and forth until Scarlet came into the room. The pair used sign language to come up with a plan, something that Scarlet could relay to Andrew as well. After a while of talking, Scarlet nodded and Yara entered her tube, ready to execute their plan. Meanwhile, in Andrew's lunchroom, Andrew stood staring at the door until Scarlet came in. Scarlet signed that she wanted Andrew to run away from the cornucopia with Yara. She then said that she saw the mentors from District 9 on the way here and told them to tell Maze to join the pair from 8 in the runaway, and also told them to tell Mazalia to run in and grab things for the group. Andrew then rightfully asked Scarlet how she knew Mazalia and Maze would stick to the plan, seeing as Maze clearly had feelings for Yara, and she admitted feelings for Andrew last night. Scarlet then signed for Andrew to trust her before pushing him into the tube as the glass closed around her. In Tia's lunchroom, Antoinette immediately met up with her. Antoinette talked to Tia about the plan that they had formulated with Tio and Anastasia, asking if she still remembered it. To which Tia replied with a nod before responding, "Kill Andrew's friends," with a smirk on her face. The pair exchanged a smirk before Antoinette helped Tia into her tube and the glass closed around her. In Tio's lunchroom, Anastasia immediately met up with him. Anastasia asked Tio if he remembered what Wolfmark told him about the 7s and 12s, to which Tio responded with an eye roll and a nod. She then asked Tio if he remembered the plan he had made with Tia, to which he nodded and responded in the same way Tia had responded to that question. Anastasia then smiled as Tio walked into his tube and watched the glass close around him. In Mercy Elizabeth's lunchroom, Aeson met up with her immediately and smiled. He congratulated Mercy Elizabeth on her making it to the games, stating that an outlier district had been completely taken out before his games. He knew how she felt when it came to the death of her ally and friend, River. Aeson then gave Mercy Elizabeth one last hug before sending her up in her tube. Finally, in Hopper's room, Hopper paced back and forth in his room until Aeson came to see him. The two cousins hugged each other before Aeson asked Hopper what the plan was. Hopper responded with an eye roll, "Protect Mercy Elizabeth." Hopper replied bluntly. Hopper then stepped into his tube and watched the glass close around him. When the tributes were lifted into the arena, they looked around, and the tributes that weren't blind could see they were on Easter Island, with the Maui situated behind them. For those who don't know, that's what the heads on Easter Island are called. The tributes all looked around and noticed their allies were actually all relatively close to them. The careers all smirked at Tia and Tio motioned towards Mazalia and Maze, signifying they wanted to pick them off. Meanwhile, Mercy Elizabeth motioned towards the boy from 11, and Hopper motioned towards Kayla from 11. Meanwhile, Yara, Andrew, Mazalia, and Maze signed to each other that they were scared about the careers and what they might do to them. Mazalia and Maze then signed that they knew the plan and would do whatever they could to stick to it. When the gong sounded, the careers ran in along with Mazalia and a few other tributes. Tia immediately grabbed a sword while Mazalia was grabbing a bottle of water. Tia then ran over to Mazalia and stabbed her in the neck as she was standing up from grabbing a second bottle of water. Meanwhile, Yara, Andrew, and Maze stood stock still on their podiums until they saw Tia kill Mazalia. This made all of them break into a full sprint towards the Maui. This is when Tio threw a knife into Maze's back and started to run towards the group. Andrew tried to drag Maze away with him, but the wound in his back caused him to scream out in pain, and Andrew could tell he was suffering. Maze then signed for Andrew to leave him and run with Yara. Andrew started to tear up before wishing Maze luck and running away with Yara. When Tio got to where Maze was, he jumped on top of Maze and slammed his boot into Maze's neck, choking him to death. Yara and Andrew cried as they got to their hiding spot and heard Maze's cannon, and the pair waited for Megan and Lewis, hoping they were okay. Meanwhile, after killing Florida, Mercy Elizabeth heard the boy from 11 trying to escape to Cornucopia. She threw her sword at the boy, and it hit him right in the back of his neck, sticking out of the other side, immediately sounding his cannon. As Hopper plunged his sword into the neck of the girl from 5, he overheard Megan and Kayla fighting over a bag. Hopper immediately got up and ran towards the fight and stabbed at the girls, stabbing his sword into the ground next to them. This caused Megan to scream and run away, leaving the bag with Kayla. Kayla clutched the bag tightly before also running away, not making a sound. After the bloodbath, 5 cannons went off, belonging to Mazalia from 9, Maze from 9, Florida from 6, the boy from 11, and the girl from 5. When Yara and Andrew noticed that Megan and Lewis must have still been alive, they smiled. Back at the cornucopia, as the careers were counting their kills, Treasure recommended that it might be a good idea to have at least one person that can actually see stay at the cornucopia when people go hunting. The plan was agreed to by most members of the Alliance. Meanwhile, on the other side of the cornucopia, Eliana complained to Mercy Elizabeth about how she didn't manage to get any kills in the initial bloodbath. Mercy Elizabeth listened to these complaints and suggested that the pair should go hunting so that Eliana could get more kills. Eliana then asked if her friend Everett could join. Mercy Elizabeth only allowed this after Eliana had allowed Mercy Elizabeth to let Tio tag along. As the group hunted, Mercy Elizabeth and Eliana took the lead. At this point, the group talked for a while about who they trusted in the Career Alliance and who they didn't. Mercy Elizabeth agreed with Eliana and Everett that Colin and Trevor weren't very trustworthy. Meanwhile, Tio didn't really trust Eliana and Everett, but he didn't say this out loud and kept it to himself, instead stating that he thought Treasure wasn't very trustworthy. Meanwhile, back at the cornucopia, Tia and Hopper talked with each other about who they trusted in the Careers Alliance. They both agreed that their district partners were obviously trustworthy, and that the Sevens were also quite trustworthy, although they did seem to disagree on Treasure. Tia said she didn't trust Treasure, but Hopper said she seemed oddly trustworthy. Eventually, Trevor and Treasure interrupted Tia and Hopper's conversation. The thing about Trevor was that Tia and Hopper both agreed that he was not very trustworthy at all. They had both also agreed that District 2 didn't need another victor so soon after their previous one. Trevor then sat down next to Tia and put his arm around her. This action pissed Tia off, and she shoved Trevor's hand away from her. Trevor just laughed and claimed that Tia was playing hard to get. This caused Tia to get up and kick Trevor in the nuts before walking away, asking for Hopper to join her. Hopper gladly obliged, not wanting to know what Treasure wanted to do with him. Meanwhile, back with Eliana, Everett, Tio, and Mercy Elizabeth, Eliana smirked slightly and nodded back at Everett. Everett took out his sword and stabbed Tio in the leg. Tio didn't really feel it, and adrenaline kicked in, causing Tio to pick Everett up and slam his back against a tree so hard it broke and his cannon sounded. This freaked out Eliana, and she sprinted away from the pair, finding and killing the boy from 3 on her way out. Mercy Elizabeth looked around as Tio looked down at his leg and noticed the stab, stating that the stab must hurt for people who aren't him, before leaning up against a tree. It was at that point that Mercy Elizabeth could finally tell what had just happened and walked over to Tio, asking him if he was okay. Tio then nodded and looked down at the wound on his leg, saying that they would need to treat it and that he saw some medkits in the cornucopia. Eventually, Mercy Elizabeth put Tio's arm around her and let him use her as a crutch. The pair then walked back to the cornucopia in the direction they had come from. When they got back to the cornucopia, they announced their arrival, causing Tia and Hopper to run over to Tio and Mercy Elizabeth, asking if they were okay. Eventually, after being told that Eliana and Everett weren't with Tio and Mercy Elizabeth by Liana, Trevor and Liana approached Tio and Mercy Elizabeth. Trevor immediately got defensive, demanding to know where Eliana was, which got the attention of most of the other careers. Tio immediately told the pair the truth, that he had killed Everett in self-defense and that Eliana had escaped. This made Liana mad, but she did nothing about it, as Tio had a reason to do what he did. Meanwhile, Trevor was fuming and took out his sword, claiming he was going to find Eliana, and he asked Treasure and Colin to join him. The pair from 1 gladly joined Trevor and left the cornucopia. Meanwhile, Tio grabbed a first aid kit and handed it over to Mercy Elizabeth. Before Mercy Elizabeth could use it, however, Liana took it, saying that a blind person taking care of a wound wasn't the best idea she had heard. Liana then went on to patch up Tio's wound, stating that he should be able to walk on it in a bit. This just caused Tio just stood up. This just caused Tio to roll his eyes and stand up, stating it didn't hurt. This caused Liana to grab Tio by the by the collar of his shirt and drag him back down to a seating position, stating that she was ordering Tio not to stand. Tio just rolled his eyes at this, but stayed seated. Meanwhile, back with Yara and Andrew, they eventually decided to roam the arena once everything went quiet. Yara led the way, holding Andrew's hand tightly as she did so. The pair still couldn't get over the loss of Mazalia and Maze, but they had to find safe water sources and food sources. As they roamed the arena, they came across a small lake in the north of the cornucopia, and a plant patch that seemed safe for both hiding and food to the east of that small lake. Yara and Andrew would set up camp in the plant patch, but then they felt something. Someone had grabbed Andrew's ankle. Andrew immediately looked down, but to his relief, it was just Megan and Lewis. Lewis then signed to Andrew that he had told the pair he was good at hiding. This made Yara and Andrew smile as they helped Megan and Lewis up. The group then smiled, and Lewis told the pair from 8 about a wound that Megan had sustained from a fight with Kayla. After a whole day of uneventfulness, The careers were hungrier for blood than they ever had been. As they were talking about who they could kill, the blind boy from 5 stumbled into their camp. Tio and Liana looked at each other before sneaking up on the boy, making sure not to make a noise. When they got to the boy, however, a sword went through his back and he fell to the ground. This sword was revealed to have been thrown by Colin. Colin then ran in the direction he threw his sword, knowing the cornucopia was this way. Tio acted quickly, however, and grabbed Colin by the collar of his shirt, lifting him into the air. Tio then slammed Colin down onto the ground, and then grabbed him by the sides of his head and bashed his head against the ground until his cannon sounded. Meanwhile, as these two cannons sounded, Megan, Lewis, Yara, and Andrew tried to count how many tributes remained, even though Yara was the only one to hear all the cannons so far. As Yara realized that there were only 13 tributes, including her and Andrew, left, she signed this fact to Andrew and the others, and they all smiled. They were the only tributes apart from Kayla and the careers left. After a few moments of talking them into it, Megan and Lewis got Yara and Andrew to agree to let them walk through the arena to find them another spot to camp just in case they needed it. After a while of the pair being gone, Yara heard 2 cannons and looked into the sky to see the portraits of Megan and Lewis. It was revealed that when Megan and Lewis ran into Kayla, the trio got into a massive fight. Although Kayla got cut up quite a bit, she was able to overpower Megan and Lewis and kill them. This caused Yara to burst into tears. Andrew hugged Yara tight and rubbed her back, although he had no idea what she was crying about. He still wanted to comfort her. After calming down a bit, Yara signed to Andrew about what had happened. Andrew looked down towards the ground and sighed, not wanting to accept their deaths. Meanwhile, back with the careers, they came up with a plan. They planned that tomorrow they'd attack Yara and Andrew's camp while the pair were asleep. Tia and Tio loved this plan the most. This kinda worried Mercy, Elizabeth, and Hopper, but they didn't say much about it. After an entire day with no deaths occurring, it was time for the careers to execute their plan. It was decided that Tia and Tio would be the ones to go out and do this, while the others stayed at the cornucopia just in case Treasure, Eliana, and Trevor returned. As Tia and Tio walked, they saw the lake Yara and Andrew had been drinking from. When they arrived at Yara and Andrew's camp, Yara was awake watching the camp. When Yara saw Tia and Tio, she screamed. Before she could attempt to wake up Andrew, though, Tio grabbed Yara's hair and yanked it, causing her to scream out in pain. Tio then grabbed Yara and ripped her hair out, causing even louder screaming from Yara. Tio then pinned Yara down on the ground and started to choke her out, pressing his fingers into Yara's throat. Yara would tear up as she looked at Andrew before her cannon sounded. Tia and Tio then got up and looked at Andrew, stating that they'll save him for later before going back to the cornucopia. Back at the cornucopia, Tio gloated about how he had killed Yara. The pair from 10 joked about how loud Yara had screamed after Tio had pulled out her hair. It was almost as if the pair from 10 didn't care about how they looked to the other careers. Meanwhile, outside of the arena, riots ramped up in Districts 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 11. These riots took extremely long to squash, but it did happen. They needed all the peacekeepers from all the career districts in order to do it, though. And this wasn't even the worst point these riots reached. Back in the arena, as Tia and Tio talked with the other careers, Kayla walked into the career camp, ready to fight. The careers gave Kayla a look that demonstrated just how scared they were of her, which to say was not at all. Kayla immediately ran in, directly at Liana, stabbing her in the throat. Liana fell to the ground, choking on her own blood. As Tio ran over to Liana to check on her, Tia acted. She listened in on where her allies were in order to know where Kayla was. Tia ran at Kayla and started to fight her. Tia swung her sword at Kayla, hitting her in the arm. Kayla screamed out but managed to stab Tia in the side, but it didn't go too far in. As Mercy Elizabeth and Hopper ran over to Liana and Tio in order to help Liana, the fight between Tia and Kayla continued. After Kayla's cannon sounded, Tia got mad and went into a flurry. After Liana's cannon sounded, Tia got mad and went into a flurry, swinging her sword wildly at Kayla, cutting open her lip, her hip, her left leg, her right hand, and her left arm. Tio, Mercy Elizabeth, and Hopper then watched as Tia plunged her sword deep into Kayla's mouth, forcing it through her throat until she died, choking on the sword blade and her own blood. So yeah, that is the end of Part 2 of the 190th Hunger Games. Part 3 will be reposted a little bit later once I have it recorded. But yeah, these will all be posted around the same time. I just have to get them all recorded. But yeah, again, that's the end of the repost of Part 2. I hope you guys will stay tuned for the repost of Part 3. Goodbye, everybody.